Guided reading. Brinkmanship. The Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, had a profound impact on U.S. foreign policy. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who took office in 1953, was convinced that the United States could not contain communism by fighting a series of small wars. These wars were not only unpopular but also too expensive. Eisenhower believed that wars had to be prevented in the first place, and the best way to do that seemed to be to threaten to use nuclear weapons. This policy came to be called massive retaliation. Under this new policy, the U.S. government would respond to any aggression by the Soviet Union or its allies with a massive nuclear strike. The idea was that the threat of such a devastating response would deter the Soviets from taking any aggressive actions in the first place. This approach allowed Eisenhower to cut military spending from around $50 billion to about $34 billion by reducing the size of the army, which was expensive to maintain. Instead, he focused on building up the U.S. nuclear arsenal, which grew from about 1,000 bombs in 1953 to about 18,000 bombs in 1961. The U.S. government also became increasingly involved in the affairs of developing nations during this time. Many of the Central Intelligence Agency's CIA operations took place in these nations, which had primarily agricultural economies. Many of these countries blamed European imperialism and American capitalism for their problems. Their leaders looked to the Soviet Union as a model of how to industrialize their countries. They often threatened to nationalize, or put under government control, foreign businesses operating in their countries. One way to stop developing nations from moving into the communist camp was to provide them with financial aid, as Eisenhower had tried to do in Egypt. In some cases, however, the threat of communism seemed stronger, and the CIA ran covert operations to overthrow anti-American leaders and replace them with pro-American leaders. These operations were often successful, but they also created resentment and hostility toward the United States in many parts of the world. Despite the success of some of these covert operations, the policy of massive retaliation had its drawbacks. The United States was seen as a bully, threatening to use nuclear weapons to get its way. Many people around the world were understandably afraid of the destructive power of nuclear weapons, and the idea of using them as a deterrent was not universally popular. In addition, the policy did not take into account the possibility of limited wars, where the use of nuclear weapons might not be appropriate or effective. Check for understanding. 1. How did the policy introduced by President Eisenhower come to be known as massive retaliation, and what implications did this label have for the United States foreign policy during the Cold War? 2. To what extent did President Eisenhower's strategies effectively prevent the spread of communism in developing nations, and what alternative approaches could have been employed to achieve this goal? Iran and Guatemala. The covert operations that took place in Iran and Guatemala during the early 1950s are two of the most infamous examples of American interventionism during the Cold War. The events in Iran and Guatemala serve as stark reminders of the lengths the United States was willing to go to protect its economic and political interests in countries around the world. The events in Iran began in 1951 when Mohammad Mossadegh was elected Prime Minister of Iran. Mossadegh's government was a democratic and nationalist movement that sought to end the British monopoly on Iran's oil reserves, which at the time were controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In 1953, Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry, angering the British and Americans who depended heavily on Iranian oil. The United States government, in conjunction with the British government, decided to remove Mossadegh from power. The CIA, under the direction of Kermit Roosevelt Jr., began a covert operation known as Operation Ajax to overthrow Mossadegh. The operation involved bribing politicians, organizing street protests, and propaganda campaigns. The CIA's efforts were successful, and Mossadegh was removed from power in a coup that restored the pro-American Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to the throne. The events in Guatemala began in 1950 when Jacobo Arbenz Guzman was elected president. Arbenz's government was a democratic and progressive movement that sought to modernize Guatemala's economy and redistribute land to the country's poor peasants. One of Arbenz' most controversial actions was the expropriation of land owned by the United Fruit Company, a U.S. owned corporation that controlled much of Guatemala's banana industry. The U.S. government, alarmed by the expropriation of United Fruit's land, decided to remove Arbenz from power. The CIA, under the direction of Allen Dulles, began a covert operation known as Operation Success to overthrow Arbenz. The operation involved arming and training anti-Arbenz rebels and propaganda campaigns. The CIA's efforts were successful, and Arbenz was removed from power in a coup that restored a pro-American military government to power. The events in Iran and Guatemala are often cited as examples of the United States' interventionism in the affairs of other countries during the Cold War. Critics argue that the United States' actions in Iran and Guatemala were motivated by economic and political interests rather than by concerns for democracy and human rights. The legacy of these events continues to be felt in Iran and Guatemala today, where the United States' role in these coups is still a contentious issue. Check for understanding. 3. What was the main reason behind the CIA's Operation Ajax in Iran, and what were the tactics used by the CIA to overthrow Mossadegh? 4. How did Arbenz's land reform program contribute to the U.S. government's decision to launch Operation Success in Guatemala, and what was the outcome of this covert operation? 5. What is the historical significance of the events in Iran and Guatemala, and why are they often cited as examples of the United States' interventionism during the Cold War? Trouble in Eastern Europe. Covert operations conducted by the United States government during the Cold War were not always successful in achieving their intended goals. The death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in 1953 marked the beginning of a power struggle within the Soviet Union. By 1956, Nikita Khrushchev had emerged as the new Soviet leader, and he quickly began to make changes to Soviet policy. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 was a turning point in the Cold War. In the speech, Khrushchev criticized Stalin's policies and emphasized the need for a more flexible approach to communism. Although the speech was meant to be private, it was leaked to the Western press, and the CIA obtained a copy of it. The CIA then distributed copies of the speech throughout Eastern Europe and the world, hoping to undermine the legitimacy of the Soviet Union and communism. The impact of Khrushchev's speech was significant, particularly in Eastern Europe. Many Eastern Europeans had long been frustrated with communist rule, and the speech further discredited the ideology. In June 1956, riots broke out in Poland, and by late October, a full-scale uprising had begun in Hungary. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 was a popular uprising against the Soviet-backed government in Hungary. The revolution was initially successful, and a new government was established, but it was short-lived. The Soviet Union was not willing to tolerate the end of communism in Hungary, and soon after the uprising began, Soviet tanks rolled into the capital of Budapest, crushing the rebellion and restoring Soviet control. The Hungarian Revolution was a significant setback for the United States' efforts to contain the spread of communism. The failure of the revolution to achieve its goals, combined with the United States' inability to intervene effectively, showed the limits of American power during the Cold War. However, the events in Hungary also marked a turning point in the Cold War. Khrushchev's willingness to tolerate greater freedom in Eastern Europe, coupled with the failure of the United States to support the Hungarian uprising, signaled a new phase in the Cold War, one marked by a shift away from direct confrontation and toward a more nuanced approach to the conflict. Check for understanding. 6. Evaluate the impact of Khrushchev's secret speech on the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. To what extent did it contribute to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union? 7. Analyze the ethical considerations of the CIA's distribution of Khrushchev's secret speech. Was it justified for the CIA to interfere in the internal affairs of another country in this way? 8. Assess the role of the United States in the Hungarian uprising of 1956. What factors contributed to the United States' decision not to intervene directly in the conflict, and how did this decision affect the outcome of the uprising?